The bitter wind howled across the Montana territory like a wounded animal, carrying with it the promise of a harsh winter to come. Bridget Fletcher shivered as she stacked the last of her firewood beside the small stone hearth, pausing to listen to the eerie chorus that had begun just beyond the tree line. Wolves. They had been growing bolder with each passing night, venturing closer to her isolated cabin as food became scarce in the higher elevations. It was 1873, and at 23, Bridget had learned that survival in this unforgiving landscape required steel in one's spine and lead in one's rifle. 3 months had passed since consumption had claimed her father, leaving her alone on the homestead they'd built together after her mother's death years before. Most women would have fled to the nearest town or sought the protection of relatives, but Bridget was not most women. She secured the cabin's door with a heavy wooden bar and checked the shutters one final time. The wolves' howls intensified, seeming to surround the small cabin from all sides. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for her father's Winchester repeating rifle. It wasn't fear of the wolves that unsettled her so much as the loneliness that descended with the darkness. Just another night, she whispered to herself, her breath forming small clouds in the chilling air of the cabin. Nothing you haven't handled before. A particularly close howl made her jolt. This one sounded different, deeper and more threatening than the others. Bridget moved to the window, carefully parting the curtain to peer out into the gathering darkness. The fading light of dusk revealed several dark shapes moving at the edge of the clearing, their eyes reflecting an eerie amber glow. A sharp crack from somewhere in the trees startled both Bridget and the wolves. The sound of a rifle shot echoed across the clearing. The wolves scattered momentarily. Their howling ceased for a precious moment of silence. Bridget strained her eyes, searching for the source of the gunshot. That's when she saw him, a tall silhouette of a man on horseback, emerging from the tree line. He rode with the easy confidence of someone who belonged in this wilderness, his broad shoulders squared against the wind. He fired another warning shot into the air, sending the remaining wolves retreating further into the forest. The stranger guided his horse toward her cabin, and Bridget's heart raced. Visitors were rare, and unannounced ones often meant trouble. She positioned herself beside the door, rifle ready as a firm knock sounded. "Hello, the cabin!" a deep voice called out. "Don't mean to disturb you, but those wolves looked mighty interested in your livestock." Bridget hesitated. "State your business, stranger." "Name's Mitchell Morrison, madam. I'm just passing through on my way to Helena. Saw your situation and thought you might appreciate some assistance with those wolves." "I can handle wolves just fine, Mr. Morrison," she replied, though the tremble in her voice betrayed her. "No doubt you can," he answered, a hint of amusement in his tone. "But even the most capable folks sometimes benefit from an extra gun. Night's falling fast, and that pack looked hungry." Bridget bit her lip, weighing her options. The wolves had indeed been getting bolder, and her 2 remaining goats would be tempting prey. After a moment's consideration, she lifted the bar and cracked open the door, keeping her rifle visible. The man standing before her was not what she expected. Though trail-worn and dusty, Mitchell Morrison had a kind face beneath several days' worth of stubble. His eyes, a striking blue that reminded her of summer skies, crinkled slightly at the corners as he removed his hat. He couldn't have been more than 30, and despite his weathered appearance, there was something immediately trustworthy about him. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Morrison, but—" Another chorus of howls, closer this time, cut off her words. "They're circling back," he said, his expression turning serious. "With your permission, I'd like to stay and help keep watch tonight. Come morning, I'll be on my way." Bridget studied him carefully. Her father had taught her to be wary of strangers, especially men traveling alone, but something in Mitchell's straightforward gaze told her he meant what he said. "You can shelter in the barn," she decided finally. "There's fresh hay in the loft." He nodded respectfully. "Much obliged. I'll tend to my horse and keep an eye on your livestock. Don't worry about the wolves tonight, Miss Fletcher, Bridget Fletcher." "Miss Fletcher, you can rest easy. Those wolves won't get past me." As Mitchell turned toward the small barn, Bridget noticed the well-worn holster at his hip and the practiced way he carried his rifle. He moved with the quiet confidence of a man accustomed to handling himself in dangerous situations. She wondered briefly who he was and what brought him through this remote stretch of territory. but she kept her questions to herself. That night, as promised, Mitchell kept the wolves at bay. Occasionally, Bridget would peer through her window to see his shadowy figure moving around the perimeter of her property. Each time the wolves' howls grew closer, a shot would ring out and silence would follow. There was something comforting about watching his shadow move through the moonlight, steady and vigilant. When morning came, Bridget awoke to the sound of chopping wood. Curious, she dressed quickly and stepped onto her porch to find a substantial pile of freshly split logs stacked neatly beside her door. Mitchell was at the chopping block. His coat discarded despite the morning chill, swinging her axe with practiced efficiency. "You didn't have to do that," she called, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. He paused mid-swing and offered a smile that sent an unexpected warmth through her. "Seemed like the least I could do for the roof over my horse's head. Besides, winter's coming fast. You'll need more than what you had." "Thank you," she said, suddenly aware of how long it had been since she'd had a proper conversation with anyone. "Would you like some breakfast before you go? It's just cornbread and coffee, but it's hot." Mitchell set the axe down, wiping his brow with his sleeve. "That would be most welcome, Miss Fletcher." Inside the cabin, Bridget busied herself with preparing the simple meal. Acutely aware of the tall figure seated at her father's table, there was something both unsettling and comforting about having another person in the space that had felt so empty these past months. "You live out here alone?" Mitchell asked, accepting the steaming mug she offered. "Since my father passed in July," she replied, setting a plate of cornbread before him. "This homestead was his dream. He staked the claim 5 years ago after my mother died." Mitchell nodded thoughtfully. "It's fine land, but isolated for a woman on her own." "I manage," Bridget said, lifting her chin slightly. "The nearest neighbor is the Wilkinsons, about 4 miles east. They check on me when they can." "And the wolves? Have they always been a problem?" "Not like this. Something's driving them down from the mountains earlier than usual. Maybe a harsh winter coming." She hesitated before adding, "They've never come so close to the cabin before last night." Mitchell broke off a piece of cornbread, his expression turning serious. "It's not just the cold driving them down. Loggers have been pushing farther into their territory up north. Animals get desperate when their hunting grounds shrink." They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes before Mitchell spoke again. "Miss Fletcher, I don't mean to overstep, but have you considered wintering in town? These mountains can be unforgiving when the snows come." "This is my home," Bridget answered firmly. "I'm not abandoning it." Mitchell studied her for a moment, respect evident in his gaze. "Then perhaps you'd allow me to help you prepare better before I continue on. Those wolves will be back, and your fences need reinforcing if you want to keep your livestock safe." Bridget wanted to refuse on principle. She'd been determined to prove she could manage alone, but practicality won out. "I can't pay you much." "I'm not asking for payment," he replied. "Just a place to rest for a day or two before I continue to Helena. The trail will still be there, and I'm in no particular hurry." Against her better judgment, Bridget found herself nodding. 2 days, then. I'll be grateful for the help." 2 days stretched into 4 as Mitchell helped reinforce the corral, repair the roof of the barn where several shingles had worked loose, and hunt enough meat to smoke for her winter stores. Each evening, the wolves would return, their howls forming an eerie backdrop to their quiet conversations by the fire. And each night, Mitchell would take up his position outside, keeping watch until dawn broke over the mountains. On the 5th morning, Bridget found herself dreading his departure more than she cared to admit. There was something about Mitchell Morrison that had brought her isolated homestead to life again. He spoke little of his past, but his knowledge of the wilderness, his skill with both tools and weapons, and his quiet, respectful manner had earned her trust. "You never mentioned what business takes you to Helena," Bridget ventured as they shared coffee on the porch, watching the sun rise over the distant peaks. Mitchell's gaze remained fixed on the horizon. "I've been offered a position with the Territorial Marshal's office. After years of riding for various ranches and scouting for the Army, I'm looking to settle somewhere." "You were a scout?" Bridget asked, intrigued. He nodded. "For the 7th Cavalry, mostly. Saw things during those years I'd rather forget." His expression darkened momentarily. "Decided I wanted to use what I know to help keep the peace rather than—" He trailed off, then shook his head slightly. Anyway, the marshal in Helena is an old friend, says he could use a deputy who knows the territory. It sounds like a fine opportunity, Bridget said, ignoring the hollow feeling in her chest at the thought of his departure. Mitchell turned to look at her then, his blue eyes searching her face. It is, but I find myself reluctant to leave you here alone with winter coming, and those wolves still prowling. Bridget felt a flush rise to her cheeks under his steady gaze. I've troubled you enough, Mr. Morrison. You've already done more than I could have asked. Mitchell, he corrected gently, and you've been no trouble at all, Miss Fletcher. Bridget, she offered in return, a small smile playing at her lips. Their eyes met, and for a moment, something unspoken passed between them. Mitchell cleared his throat and stood, breaking the spell. I should check the fences one more time before I go, he said. Make sure everything is secure. As he walked toward the corral, Bridget remained on the porch, watching him move with that easy, confident stride that had become so familiar in such a short time. She couldn't deny the attraction she felt, but she chided herself for such foolishness. Men like Mitchell Morrison didn't stay in one place for long, especially not on a struggling homestead with a woman they barely knew. Later that afternoon, as Mitchell saddled his horse in preparation for departure, dark clouds began gathering over the mountains. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of snow. Storm's coming, Mitchell observed, glancing at the darkening sky. Might be the first big snow of the season. Bridget followed his gaze, a flutter of anxiety rising in her chest. Early winter storms in the territory could be treacherous, sometimes dumping several feet of snow overnight. Perhaps you should wait until it passes, she suggested, trying to keep her tone casual. The trail to Helena will be difficult if this turns into a blizzard. Mitchell seemed to hesitate, looking from the threatening sky to his saddled horse. Before he could respond, a long, mournful howl echoed from the nearby forest, followed by several more. The wolves had returned, and they sounded closer than ever. They're hunting before the storm, Mitchell said grimly, and they've brought friends. As if to confirm his words, a large gray wolf emerged from the tree line, followed by several others. They kept their distance but moved with a purpose that sent chills down Bridget's spine. These weren't the cautious, skulking predators of previous nights. They were bold, hungry, and far too numerous. Get inside, Mitchell ordered quietly, loosening his revolver in its holster. I'll see to the livestock. I can help, Bridget insisted, already moving toward the cabin to retrieve her rifle. This is my home to defend. Mitchell's expression softened for a moment. I know it is, but those wolves mean business, and I need to know you're safe. Before she could argue further, one of the wolves darted toward the goat pen, causing the animals inside to bleat in panic. Mitchell fired a warning shot, and the wolf retreated momentarily, but the others began to spread out, circling the property in a hunting formation that spoke of dangerous intelligence. Bridget, Mitchell said firmly, we need to get the goats into the barn and secure it. Then we both get to the cabin. This isn't a night for heroics. Together, they managed to herd the frightened goats into the barn. Mitchell barred the door securely, while Bridget stood watch, rifle ready. The wolves had grown bolder, venturing closer to the buildings as the light began to fade. Inside now, Mitchell said, taking her arm gently but firmly as they backed toward the cabin door. The first snowflakes had begun to fall, large and wet, promising a heavy accumulation. Once inside, Mitchell immediately began checking the cabin's defenses, the heavy wooden shutters, the barred door, the small windows that could serve as firing positions if necessary. Bridget stoked the fire higher, trying to push back the encroaching darkness and the fear that came with it. They've never been this aggressive, she said, watching through a crack in the shutters as dark shapes moved through the swirling snow. Something's wrong. They're desperate, Mitchell replied, standing beside her to peer out. The early storm, the disruption of their territory, they're hunting whatever they can find before winter sets in fully. The wolves' howls grew louder as darkness fell completely, punctuated occasionally by snarls and yips that suggested fighting among the pack. The storm intensified, the wind driving snow against the cabin in fierce gusts that rattled the shutters. At least the storm might drive them to seek shelter, Bridget said hopefully. Mitchell shook his head. Wolves are built for this weather, and once they've set their minds on prey, they can be persistent. As if to illustrate his point, a heavy thud sounded against the door, followed by scratching and snuffling noises. Bridget gasped, instinctively moving closer to Mitchell, who placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "They're testing the defenses," he said quietly. "But this cabin is solid. They can't get in." Throughout the long night, the wolves continued their siege, their howls mixing with the wailing of the wind to create an otherworldly chorus of threat. Mitchell maintained his vigilance, occasionally firing a shot through a cracked shutter when the wolves ventured too close to the door or the barn. Bridget tried to remain calm, but as the hours wore on, exhaustion and anxiety took their toll. She found herself drawing strength from Mitchell's steady presence, his unwavering focus, and the quiet confidence he exuded even in the face of danger. "You should try to rest," he told her sometime after midnight, when the howling had temporarily subsided. "I'll keep watch." "I couldn't sleep," she admitted. "Not with them out there." Mitchell's expression softened in the firelight. "You're safe, Bridget. I promise you that." Something in his voice, in the way he looked at her then, made her believe him completely. For the first time since her father's death, Bridget felt truly protected. "Why did you really stop here that first night?" she asked suddenly. "You could have ridden past. Most travelers would have." Mitchell was quiet for a long moment, his gaze returning to the window. "I saw smoke from your chimney, and something told me I should check. When I got closer and saw the wolves, I knew I couldn't just ride on." He paused. "My sister lived alone on a homestead like this, up in Dakota Territory. She died 3 winters ago, during a blizzard. No one knew until spring." The pain in his voice was raw, and Bridget instinctively reached for his hand. "I'm sorry." His fingers closed around hers, warm and strong. "When I saw you standing in that doorway, rifle ready to defend what's yours, I couldn't leave you to face those wolves alone." Their eyes met in the flickering firelight, and Bridget felt something shift between them, a connection deeper than the circumstance that had brought them together. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to imagine what it might be like to have Mitchell Morrison in her life permanently, to never face another long, lonely night in this wilderness. The moment was broken by a renewed chorus of howls, closer than before. Mitchell reluctantly released her hand and moved back to the window. "They're getting bolder. The storm's driving them to take bigger risks." Indeed, the wolves had begun a more coordinated assault on the barn, their howls interspersed with the frightened bleating of the goats inside. "My rifle's loaded," Bridget said, moving to his side. "We can defend the barn from here." Mitchell nodded grimly. "If they break in, we'll have to." For the next several hours, they took turns watching and firing warning shots when the wolves ventured too close to the barn doors. The storm intensified, snow piling against the cabin walls and drifting across the yard, obscuring their view and muffling the sounds of the siege. Dawn approached slowly, the faint lightening of the eastern sky barely visible through the driving snow. As the first gray light filtered through the storm clouds, the wolves' attacks grew more desperate, sensing their hunting time growing short. "They're not giving up," Bridget said worriedly, watching as a particularly large wolf threw itself against the barn door. Mitchell checked his ammunition. "They will. Wolves don't like to hunt in daylight if they can avoid it, and they've expended a lot of energy in this cold." He was right. As the morning light strengthened, the attacks became less frequent. By mid-morning, the howling had ceased entirely, though occasionally they could see a dark shape moving through the trees at the edge of the clearing. The storm, however, showed no signs of abating. Snow continued to fall heavily, already accumulating to impressive depths around the cabin. The wind howled almost as eerily as the wolves had, driving the snow into drifts that would make travel impossible. "You won't be leaving for Helena today," Bridget observed, watching Mitchell's face for his reaction. He nodded, eyes still scanning the tree line for signs of the wolves. "No, this storm could last for days. I hope you don't mind the continued company." "I'm grateful for it," she admitted. "I don't think I would have managed those wolves alone." Mitchell turned to her then, his expression serious. "You're stronger than you realize, Bridget Fletcher, but everyone needs help sometimes, even stubborn homesteaders." The faintest smile touched her lips. "Even stubborn cowboys turn deputy marshals?" His answering smile warmed her more than the fire. "Especially them." The storm lasted 3 days, dumping nearly 4 feet of snow across the valley. The wolves retreated deeper into the forest, forced to seek other hunting grounds as the weather made their coordinated attacks too costly in terms of energy expended versus potential reward. But during those 3 days of enforced proximity, something remarkable happened between Bridget and Mitchell. They talked, really talked, sharing stories of their pasts, their dreams, their fears. Mitchell told her about his years as a scout, the things he'd witnessed during the conflicts between settlers and native tribes, and his growing disillusionment with the Army's tactics. Bridget spoke of her childhood in Missouri, her mother's death from a fever, and her father's determination to build a new life in the territories despite the hardships. They worked together, venturing out in the brief lulls in the storm to check on the livestock, clear paths between the buildings, and shore up defenses against both weather and predators. Mitchell taught Bridget more about tracking and predicting wolf behavior, while she shared her knowledge of preserving food and preparing for the isolation of winter. And in the evenings, by the warmth of the fire, they discovered a different kind of heat between them, a growing attraction that neither could deny. It was in the lingering glances, the brush of fingers when passing a coffee cup, the way Mitchell's voice would soften when he spoke her name. On the 4th morning, the storm finally broke, revealing a transformed landscape glittering under a brilliant blue sky. The snow lay deep and unbroken across the valley, the distant mountains standing sharp and clear against the horizon. Mitchell stood on the porch, surveying the beautiful but daunting vista. "The trail to Helena will be impassable for at least a week, maybe more," he said as Bridget joined him. "So you're still my guest," she replied, trying to hide the pleasure in her voice. He turned to look at her, his eyes serious. "Bridget, there's something I need to say." Her heart quickened. "Yes? These past days, being here with you." He paused, searching for words. "I've been wandering for a long time. Never staying anywhere, always moving on to the next job, the next territory. But here, in this place, with you, I've felt something I haven't felt in years." "What's that?" she asked softly. "Like I'm where I'm supposed to be." He took her hand, his touch gentle but sure. "I know we haven't known each other long, and I'm not asking for any promises, but when the trail's clear, I'd like to come back, if you'd be amenable to that." Bridget felt warmth spread through her chest, despite the cold air. "I would, very much." Mitchell's smile transformed his weathered face, making him look younger, more carefree. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss that started gentle but quickly deepened with a hunger that surprised them both. When they finally parted, both breathing harder, Mitchell rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that since the second day," he admitted. Bridget laughed softly. "What stopped you?" "Respect, and fear that you'd shoot me for taking liberties." She reached up to touch his face, tracing the line of his jaw. "I still might, if you don't do it again." Their second kiss was interrupted by a distant howl, a reminder that, while the immediate danger had passed, the wolves remained a presence in their world. Mitchell pulled back slightly, his expression turning serious. "They'll be back," he said. "Maybe not tonight or tomorrow, but they know there's potential prey here." Bridget nodded. "I know, but I'm not afraid anymore." In the days that followed, as the snow began to settle and compress under its own weight, Mitchell continued to help Bridget prepare for the long winter ahead. They hunted together when conditions allowed, adding to her stores of smoked meat. He showed her how to set snares for rabbits and how to identify wolf tracks to better understand their movements. The wolves maintained a presence around the homestead, but their behavior changed. Rather than the desperate, coordinated attacks of the storm night, they kept their distance, occasionally testing the defenses but retreating when confronted. Mitchell explained that they were establishing boundaries, learning to respect the human presence while still keeping the homestead within their territory. "It's a kind of uneasy truce," he told Bridget as they tracked a small pack's movements one clear morning. "They're intelligent enough to recognize a fight they can't win, but hungry enough to keep watching for an opportunity." 2 weeks after the storm, the trail to Helena was finally passable enough for travel. Mitchell prepared his horse, packing supplies Bridget insisted he take for the journey. The morning of his departure was crisp and clear, the snow sparkling under a bright winter sun. "I'll be back within a month," he promised as he secured his saddlebags. "Sooner if I can manage it." The marshal's expecting me, but once I've settled matters there, I'll return." Bridget stood watching him, trying to hide her anxiety at the thought of being alone again. "The wolves?" Mitchell understood her unspoken question. "They'll keep their distance if you maintain the routine we've established. Don't go out after dark, keep the livestock secured, and make your presence known regularly." "They're cautious by nature." He mounted his horse, but hesitated before riding out. "Bridget, I know this is sudden and perhaps improper, given how short our acquaintance has been, but I need you to know that what I feel for you is real. In these weeks, you've come to mean more to me than anyone has in a very long time." Bridget stepped closer, placing her hand on his leg. "It's the same for me, Mitchell. I'll be waiting for your return." With a final promise and a lingering look, Mitchell rode away, following the trail that would take him to Helena. Bridget watched until he disappeared into the trees, then returned to the cabin that somehow felt emptier than it had before his arrival. True to his word, Mitchell returned exactly 1 month later. Riding through a light February snow, with supplies from town and news of his appointment as deputy marshal, he spoke of his duties, which would take him throughout the territory, but always bring him back to the central office in Helena. "It's a day's ride from here in good weather," he told her as they sat by the fire that evening. "I've spoken with Marshal Jenkins about my situation. He understands my desire to have a life outside the badge." Bridget looked up from her mending, heart quickening at the implication. "Your situation?" Mitchell set aside his coffee cup and moved to kneel before her chair, taking her hands in his. "Bridget Fletcher, I know this is faster than propriety might dictate, but life out here doesn't always allow for lengthy courtships. These past weeks away from you have only confirmed what I already knew. I love you. I want to build a life with you, if you'll have me." Tears welled in Bridget's eyes as joy bloomed in her chest. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll have you, Mitchell Morrison." His answering smile was brilliant as he pulled her into his arms, sealing their agreement with a kiss that promised much more. They were married in April, as the last of the winter snow melted from the valley and the first green shoots appeared in Bridget's small garden. The ceremony was simple, performed by a traveling preacher with the Wilkinsons and a few of Mitchell's colleagues from the marshal's office as witnesses. Bridget wore her mother's dress, carefully altered, and carried wildflowers gathered from the meadow where they had first tracked the wolves together. Life settled into a new pattern after that. Mitchell's duties as deputy marshal took him away for days or sometimes weeks at a time, but he always returned to the homestead that was now truly their home. Together, they expanded the cabin, adding rooms for the family they hoped to have. They increased the livestock, planted more crops, and gradually transformed the struggling homestead into a prosperous small ranch. The wolves remained a presence in their lives, their howls a familiar sound in the night. But as Mitchell had predicted, they maintained their distance, establishing a wary coexistence with the humans who shared their territory. Occasionally, during harsh winters, they would venture closer to the buildings, and Mitchell would stand watch through the night, his shadow keeping them at bay until morning. In the spring of 1875, Bridget gave birth to their first child, a daughter they named Margaret after Mitchell's mother. 2 years later, a son joined their family, followed by another daughter in 1879. The homestead rang with children's laughter, and the loneliness that had once permeated the isolated cabin was replaced by the warm chaos of family life. Mitchell continued his work with the marshal's office, earning a reputation for fairness and integrity throughout the territory. As the years passed, he was offered promotions that would have taken him to bigger towns, even to the territorial capital, but he always declined, preferring to remain close to the home and family he cherished. Bridget flourished as well, her natural strength and resilience finding new purpose in motherhood and in managing their growing ranch. She taught their children to respect the wilderness that surrounded them, including the wolves that still howled in the distance on winter nights. "They were here before us," she would tell the children as they listened wide-eyed to the eerie chorus. "And they'll be here after. We share this land with them, just as your father and I have always done." On cold winter nights, when the wolves' howls echoed across the snow-covered valley, Bridget would often find Mitchell standing at the window, watching the darkness with the same vigilance he had shown that first night. She would slip her arm around his waist, leaning into the solid strength of him, and remember how it all began, with wolves howling around her home and a cowboy's shadow keeping them away till morning. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked him once, on the 10th anniversary of the night they met. "Stopping here that night? Staying?" Mitchell turned from the window to look at her, his blue eyes still as clear and direct as they had been that first day, though lines of experience now framed them. "Never? Not for a single moment. Meeting you was the best thing that ever happened to me, Bridget Morrison." "Even with all the wolves?" she teased. He gathered her close, his arms as strong and sure as they had been a decade before. "Especially with the wolves. They brought me to you." He kissed her then, with the same passion that had always burned between them. "And for that, I'll always be grateful to them." Outside, a wolf howled in the darkness, joined moments later by others, a wild, ancient chorus that no longer brought fear, but rather a reminder of the night their story began. And as snow fell gently beyond the window, Mitchell and Bridget held each other close in the warm sanctuary of the home they had built together, listening to the wolves sing their winter song. In the years that followed, their children grew strong and capable, learning the ways of both wilderness and civilization. Margaret, the eldest, inherited her mother's determination and her father's calm strength, eventually becoming a teacher in the growing settlement that had sprung up 10 miles to the east. Young Mitchell Jr. showed a natural affinity for ranching, expanding the family holdings as he came of age. Their youngest, Emma, surprised everyone by developing a passionate interest in law, eventually studying in Helena and becoming one of the territory's first female legal clerks. The territory itself changed around them, transforming slowly from frontier wilderness to settled land as Montana moved towards statehood. Towns grew larger, railroads pushed through the mountains, and the old ways began to fade. The vast wolf packs that had once roamed freely became less common as hunting and habitat loss took their toll. But on the Morrison Ranch, a different relationship with the natural world prevailed. Mitchell and Bridget maintained their respect for the wilderness, even as they built their prosperous homestead. They refused to join the widespread wolf hunting that became common throughout the region, instead finding ways to protect their livestock while allowing the predators their space. "There's room enough for all of us," Mitchell would say when neighbors criticized their tolerance of the wolves. They were here first, and they helped keep the balance. As they entered their later years, with silver threading their hair, and the ranch operations increasingly in the hands of their son and his family, Mitchell and Bridget often reflected on the strange twist of fate that had brought them together. "Divine providence," Bridget would say, "disguised as hungry wolves." Mitchell would smile at that, the same smile that had first captured her heart in the firelight of her lonely cabin. However it happened, I'm grateful for every day since. In the winter of 1912, nearly 40 years after that fateful night, Mitchell passed peacefully in his sleep with Bridget by his side. That evening, as his children and grandchildren gathered at the ranch to mourn and remember, a single wolf appeared at the edge of the property, a large, silver-gray animal that stood watching the house for several minutes before disappearing back into the trees. Bridget, standing at the window where Mitchell had so often kept his vigil, smiled through her tears at the sight. "Still watching over us," she whispered, "always." She lived 5 more years, long enough to see the ranch thriving under the next generation's care, long enough to welcome great-grandchildren and to witness Montana's transformation into a modern state. When her time came, it was during a winter storm, much like the one that had trapped Mitchell at her cabin all those years before. As the wind howled around the ranch house, her family gathered close, listening to her tell, one last time, the story of how wolves and a winter storm had brought her the love of her life. The legend of Mitchell and Bridget Morrison became part of the region's folklore, the tale of a lonely homesteader, a pack of hungry wolves, and the cowboy who stopped to help and found a home. Their descendants continue to tell the story, passing it down through generations along with the ranch that remained in the family for over a century. And though the great wolf packs eventually disappeared from much of the Montana landscape, on the Morrison Ranch they were always remembered not as enemies but as the unlikely matchmakers who brought together 2 souls destined to build a legacy of love in the wilderness. Every winter, when snow blankets the valley and the wind sings through the pines, those who know the story say you can still hear wolves howling around the original homestead, and if you watch carefully at dawn, you might glimpse the shadow of a cowboy keeping them at bay till morning.